We're not here to entertain nostalgic fantasies about family farming. This land belongs to those who can afford it. The harsh words sliced through the auction hall as 72-year-old Harold Thompson stood frozen, the stack of documents in his weathered hands suddenly feeling heavier. But 20 minutes later, when 3 black SUVs with government plates pulled into the parking lot, auctioneer Victor Caldwell's smug expression shattered as the distinguished man who emerged introduced himself. "I'm Senator James Thompson. Harold Thompson is my father, and I believe we need to discuss your auction practices before another acre of historic farmland changes hands." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Pinecrest Auction House dominated the commercial district of Riverdale County. Its imposing glass and steel addition to the original timber frame building symbolizing the region's rapid transition from agricultural heritage to commercial development. Once the gathering place where farming families traded equipment and livestock, the auction house now specialized in transforming generations-old family farms into investment opportunities for corporate agricultural conglomerates and luxury housing developers. Victor Caldwell had built his reputation on these transactions. At 54, his custom suits and metropolitan connections set him apart in the rural community he'd grown up in but had long outgrown. Over 15 years, he had perfected the art of marketing agricultural investment opportunities with development potential to out-of-state buyers who never intended to work the land themselves. The Grand Hall of Pinecrest reflected this new reality. Digital screens displayed satellite imagery of properties, soil analysis reports, and potential subdivision plans. The original wooden beams still crossed the ceiling, but below them the old wooden benches had been replaced with cushioned seats where representatives from investment firms and development companies now sat, tapping on tablets and smartphones. "Today's featured property," Caldwell announced from his elevated platform, his voice carrying the polished authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "is the historic Willow Creek Estate. 480 acres of prime agricultural land with exceptional development potential and no restrictive covenants. We'll start the bidding at $4, $5 million. The attendees settled in as Caldwell highlighted the property's strategic location near the planned interstate expansion, its water rights, and the preliminary approval already secured for rezoning portions for residential development. The assembled buyers, mostly representatives from agricultural investment firms and development companies, nodded appreciatively. The auction house doors opened quietly, and Harold Thompson entered, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who had spent his life working outdoors. At 72, his face was weathered by decades under the sun, his hands bearing the calluses and subtle scars of a lifetime of physical labor. He carried a leather portfolio containing carefully organized documents, some new printouts and others yellowed with age. He took a seat in the back row, his faded plaid shirt and well-worn denim making him conspicuous among the business attire surrounding him. Caldwell noticed the newcomer immediately, a slight frown crossing his face, before he continued his elaborate description of potential returns on investment. As the bidding began, corporate representatives raised their paddles, pushing the price upward in $250,000 increments. The auctioneer orchestrated the proceedings with practiced precision, building excitement as the price climbed well beyond what any local farmer could hope to match. During a brief pause between bids, Harold raised his hand. "Excuse me," he called, his voice carrying a quiet authority that came from decades of community respect. "There's important information about this property that should be disclosed before bidding continues." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Caldwell's professional smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, if you're not registered to bid, I must ask you to refrain from interrupting the proceedings." "I'm not trying to disrupt," Harold replied calmly, "but there's a significant historical designation pending for the northern section of this property. The Riverdale Historical Commission submitted the application 3 months ago." Caldwell's irritation became visible. "Sir, all legal aspects of this property have been thoroughly vetted by our legal team. Unless you're prepared to participate, with a minimum bid of $4, $5 million, I must ask you to remain silent." Harold opened his portfolio, removing a document. The historical designation would prevent development on approximately 120 acres containing indigenous archaeological sites. Identified last year, the Commission's preliminary findings indicate structures dating back at least 500 years. Caldwell stepped away from his podium, approaching Harold directly. "Mr. Thompson, Harold Thompson, correct? Mr. Thompson, this is a private auction for qualified investors. We're not here to debate potential designations that may or may not be approved. I served on the Historical Commission for 18 years, Harold explained. The designation approval is scheduled for next month. Any buyer should know that development plans for that section would likely be restricted." "What might be restricted," Caldwell interrupted coldly, "is speculative at best. These parcels will be sold today according to current legal status, not pending applications or possibilities." Harold removed another document from his portfolio. "I have a copy of the preliminary approval here, signed by the State Preservation Office last week. The archaeological significance is well documented." "Security," Caldwell called over his shoulder. "Please escort this gentleman out. He's disrupting a private business event." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 2 men in dark suits approached as shocked whispers spread through the room. "I'm simply providing relevant information about the property," Harold said, his voice steady despite the humiliation. "Potential buyers deserve to know about restrictions that will affect their investment." Caldwell's voice took on a dismissive tone intended to be heard by his wealthy clients. "Mr. Thompson, I understand that watching these old properties change hands must be difficult for certain residents clinging to the past. But this is the nature of progress and market economics. We are not here to entertain nostalgic fantasies about family farming. This land belongs to those who can afford it." A pained expression flickered across Harold's face at the public humiliation, but he carefully returned the documents to his portfolio and stood with dignity. "My family farmed in this valley for 4 generations, Mr. Caldwell. We understood something you've forgotten, that land isn't just a commodity. It carries history and responsibility. The responsibility of property," Caldwell replied with exaggerated patience, "falls to its legal owners, not to those who can no longer afford to maintain it. The market determines the highest and best use of resources, Mr. Thompson. Perhaps it's time you accepted that reality." As security personnel moved to escort him, Harold paused and looked back at the room of investors. That archaeological site contains the remains of a village that stood for centuries before any of our families arrived here. Some things should be preserved, regardless of profit potential. Caldwell returned to his podium with a tight smile. My apologies for the interruption, ladies and gentlemen. Some people struggle to accept that land, like anything else of value, ultimately belongs to those with the vision and resources to maximize its potential. Now, shall we continue with the bidding? We were at $575 million. Outside in the parking lot, Harold stood beside his aging pickup truck, the faded blue paint contrasting with the luxury vehicles filling most spaces. His face remained composed, despite the humiliation he had just endured. He gently placed his portfolio on the passenger seat and pulled out his phone. "James, it's Dad," he said after a moment. "I tried to inform them about the historical designation on Willow Creek, but they wouldn't listen. Caldwell had me removed from the auction." He listened briefly. No, I'm fine. Just concerned about the archaeological site. Once it's destroyed, that history is gone forever." After another pause, "You don't need to do that, son. You have more important matters to attend to in Washington." As Harold ended the call, he did notice Victor Caldwell watching from the auction house window, a satisfied smirk on his face as he observed the old farmer climbing into his truck. In Caldwell's mind, he had eliminated a potential complication to his perfectly orchestrated land sale and sent a clear message to other locals who might consider interfering with his business. He had no idea that his confident certainty was about to be shattered. The auction resumed its steady rhythm after Harold Thompson's departure. Victor Caldwell quickly re-established control of the room, his confidence seemingly unshaken by the brief disruption. Corporate representatives continued their bidding on the fertile Willow Creek estate, with prices climbing towards $7 million. Parcel 3 includes the original homestead and surrounding 75 acres, Caldwell announced, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a man who knew he was about to make a substantial commission. This section features the historic barn and spring house, which could be converted to an exceptional guest house or corporate retreat. We're currently at $6.08 million from Heartland Agricultural Investments. Do I hear $7 million? In the parking lot, Harold Thompson sat in his truck, his weathered hands still resting on the steering wheel. He hadn't started the engine yet. Instead, he was looking at an old photograph tucked into the visor, a picture of himself as a young man standing with his wife and their son James beside the spring house at Willow Creek Farm. The Thompson family had never owned that particular property, but Harold had spent countless summers working there as a young man, helping the Willow family who had been neighbors and friends for generations. Harold wasn't fighting for personal gain. That had never been his motivation through 18 years on the Historical Commission or his decades of community service. He was fighting to preserve the rich tapestry of history that defined Riverdale County, not just the stories of European settlers, but the indigenous people who had tended this land for centuries before. The archaeological site at Willow Creek represented one of the most significant discoveries in the state's history, a window into a past that deserved protection. His reflections were interrupted by the distant sound of vehicles approaching. Harold glanced in his rearview mirror and was startled to see 3 black SUVs with government plates turning into the auction house parking lot. 2 motorcycle officers from the state police led the small motorcade, their lights flashing as they escorted the convoy. "Oh, James," Harold murmured, recognizing the official vehicles. You really didn't need to come all this way." Inside the auction house, Caldwell was in his element, having just secured a $2 million bid on the property. Excellent! That's $2 million from Eastern Development Group. Do I hear $4 million? Remember, ladies and gentlemen, this is a rare opportunity to acquire land with this combination of agricultural capacity and development potential. A representative from Westland Consolidated raised his paddle. $4 million. I have $7. $4 million. Do I hear $6 million? Caldwell's patter was interrupted by the sound of vehicles pulling up outside. The auction house's large windows offered a clear view of the parking lot, where attendees could now see the procession of official vehicles coming to a stop. "As I was saying," Caldwell continued, attempting to recapture the room's attention, "we have $4 million. Do I hear $6 million for this exceptional property?" But the bidders were distracted now, murmuring amongst themselves as they watched the scene unfolding in the parking lot. The center SUV's door opened, and a distinguished man in his late 40s emerged. Several people in the room immediately recognized him. "Is that Senator Thompson?" someone whispered loudly enough to be heard throughout the room. Caldwell's confident demeanor faltered momentarily. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, we have important business to conduct. I'm sure whatever official business is taking place outside can proceed without our attention. Now do I hear $7, $6 million for the Willow Creek estate?" The auction house doors swung open, and two staffers in professional attire entered, scanning the room before nodding to someone outside. Behind them came a man whose face was familiar to everyone in the room. Senator James Thompson, the state's junior senator and rising political star, known for his work on agricultural policy and historic preservation. Despite his Washington career, he retained the demeanor of his rural upbringing, approachable but commanding respect. Flanking him were his chief of staff and the chair of the State Historical Commission, both carrying portfolios of documents. Harold Thompson entered last, looking somewhat embarrassed by the dramatic entrance, but resolute nonetheless. Caldwell's face went through a rapid sequence of expressions: surprise, confusion, alarm, and finally an attempt at professional courtesy. "Senator Thompson, this is an unexpected honor. We're in the middle of an auction, but of course you're welcome to observe. Perhaps your staff would like to place a bid on behalf of a conservation initiative." Senator Thompson ignored Caldwell entirely, instead turning to address the room at large. "Good morning, everyone. I apologize for interrupting your proceedings, but an urgent matter regarding this property has come to my attention." His voice carried natural authority without raising its volume. "I've been informed that this auction may be proceeding without full disclosure of pending legal designations that would significantly impact development plans for this property." Caldwell moved quickly from behind his podium. "Senator, I assure you that all legal requirements have been meticulously followed. Our legal team has thoroughly vetted this property. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding about speculative future designations." "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Caldwell," the senator replied coolly. "I've just spoken with the director of the State Preservation Office. They confirmed that Willow Creek Farm contains one of the most significant archaeological sites discovered in our state in the past 50 years. The preliminary approval for historical designation was signed last week." The chair of the Historical Commission stepped forward, opening his portfolio. We have certified copies of the preliminary designation right here. The archaeological survey confirmed extensive remains of an indigenous settlement dating back approximately 500 years, with artifacts indicating continuous habitation for over 3 centuries. He displayed satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar results showing the outlines of numerous structures beneath the soil in the northern section of the property. This designation will prohibit any ground-disturbing activity on approximately 120 acres of the property. Furthermore, a protected viewshed will limit development on an additional 60 acres. A wave of murmurs swept through the audience as the corporate bidders quickly calculated how these restrictions would impact their development plans and potential returns on investment. "Senator Thompson," Caldwell said, struggling to maintain his composure, "with all due respect, pending designations are precisely that, pending. They represent potential future restrictions, not current legal encumbrances that require disclosure." "Actually, Mr. Caldwell," the senator countered, "state law requires disclosure of pending historical designations that have received preliminary approval, particularly when they involve archaeological resources. This requirement was added to the state's real estate code 3 years ago, legislation that I sponsored, in fact." The room had gone completely silent now, all eyes moving between Caldwell and the senator. "I don't appreciate these insinuations, Senator," Caldwell said, his professional facade beginning to crack. "These properties have been properly vetted according to standard industry practices." "Standard industry practices don't supersede state law, Mr. Caldwell," the Historical Commission chair interjected. "And state law requires full disclosure of pending historical designations before sale." Senator Thompson turned to address the bidders directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of transparency and to prevent any of you from making investments based on incomplete information, I'm requesting a temporary halt to these proceedings, pending full disclosure of the property's legal status and encumbrances." He nodded to his staff, who moved to distribute information packets to the potential buyers. "These materials outline the specific areas affected by the designation and the types of activities that would be restricted. Any development plans would need to accommodate these protections." Caldwell looked around desperately, seeking support from the crowd, but the corporate representatives were already reviewing the materials, clearly reassessing the property's value given the new information. "This is unprecedented interference in a private business transaction," he protested. "On the contrary," Senator Thompson replied calmly, "this is ensuring that business transactions proceed with full transparency and compliance with state law. My father attempted to provide this information through appropriate channels, and you had him removed from the premises." All eyes turned to Harold Thompson, who stood quietly at the back of the room, still holding his portfolio of documents. "Your father," Caldwell stammered, the color draining from his face as he finally made the connection. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell, Harold Thompson, the man clinging to nostalgic fantasies you so dismissively ejected, is my father. He served on the Historical Commission for nearly 2 decades and has dedicated his life to preserving our region's heritage." The senator's voice remained measured, but there was steel beneath his calm exterior. More importantly, he was trying to ensure that all parties to this sale had accurate information about the property, information that would significantly affect its value and potential uses, something you actively prevented. Caldwell looked desperately toward his legal counsel, who had sunk low in his chair, already recognizing the severity of the situation. "Senator Thompson," Caldwell began, attempting to recover, "had I known Mr. Thompson was your father—" "Had you known," the senator interrupted sharply, "would you have treated him with the respect every citizen deserves? Would you have dismissed his concerns because of his clothes or his age? Or would you have listened only because of his connection to me?" Caldwell had no answer. "I believe this auction needs to be rescheduled," Senator Thompson continued, his voice firm but measured. "Not cancelled, rescheduled with full disclosure of the historical designation and its implications for development. Buyers deserve complete information before making multi-million-dollar investments, and sellers deserve fair market value from buyers who understand exactly what they're purchasing." The potential buyers were already huddled in small groups, consulting with colleagues via phone and reassessing their interest given the new information. Several representatives appeared to be packing their materials, preparing to leave. Caldwell made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Senator, perhaps we could take a brief recess to incorporate this information, then resume the auction today. Many of these investors have traveled considerable distances." "Mr. Caldwell," the senator replied, "the proper course of action is to postpone the auction, update all marketing materials with accurate information about the property's status, and allow potential buyers time to adjust their valuations accordingly. Anything less would be a disservice to both buyers and sellers." He turned to address the assembled investors. "I apologize for any inconvenience this causes. My office will be happy to provide detailed information about the historical designation process and its implications for development planning. When this auction is properly rescheduled, you'll be able to bid with confidence, knowing exactly what you're purchasing." As the corporate representatives began filing out, many nodding respectfully to the senator while casting accusatory glances at Caldwell, the auctioneer stood frozen behind his podium, watching his carefully orchestrated event and substantial commission evaporate. Harold Thompson approached his son, his weathered face showing a mixture of pride and embarrassment. "James, I didn't call you to shut down the auction. I just wanted someone to verify the historical designation status." The senator smiled at his father, briefly dropping his official demeanor. "I know, Dad, but when you told me they'd thrown you out for trying to share vital information about the property, it confirmed concerns we've been hearing about auction practices across the state. The Archaeological Resources Protection Act amendments we passed 3 years ago were designed specifically to prevent situations like this." He lowered his voice. "We've had reports from 3 counties about Caldwell's failure to disclose historical and environmental restrictions on properties he's auctioned. The buyers later find themselves unable to implement their development plans and end up in costly litigation." Harold glanced over at Caldwell, who was now engaged in an intense conversation with his legal counsel. "He's built quite a business transforming our farming communities piece by piece." "That business model is about to change," the senator replied. The chair of the Historical Commission had joined several investors who appeared particularly interested in the archaeological findings, explaining the significance of the discovery with genuine enthusiasm. Across the room, Caldwell looked up and caught Harold's eye. The auctioneer's expression had transformed from smugness to something approaching fear as he watched state officials answering questions from potential buyers who now understood they had nearly purchased property with significant undisclosed restrictions. In the span of 20 minutes, his carefully constructed reputation for delivering clean properties to developers had begun to crumble. Harold felt no triumph, only quiet satisfaction that the indigenous history preserved in that soil might now receive the respect it deserved. Outside, the autumn sun illuminated the rolling hills surrounding Riverdale County, the farmland at the center of the controversy stretching toward the horizon. Land that had been tended by generations of farmers who understood that ownership was temporary, but stewardship was eternal. The senator's convoy remained parked outside the auction house, a visible reminder that even in changing times, some principles remained worth defending. 3 days later, Harold Thompson sat at his kitchen table, sorting through seed catalogues for the small organic vegetable operation he maintained since selling most of his family farm 5 years earlier. Though he had been forced to sell the majority of his land due to mounting healthcare costs after his wife's long illness, he had retained 10 acres where he grew heirloom vegetables for local restaurants and the farmers' market. The distinctive sound of tires on gravel drew his attention. Through the window, he saw an unfamiliar luxury car pulling up beside his weathered pickup truck. A moment later, Victor Caldwell emerged, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the rural setting. Harold opened the door before Caldwell could knock. "Mr. Caldwell," he said with a nod, his tone neither hostile nor particularly welcoming. "Mr. Thompson." The auctioneer shifted his weight awkwardly. "I was hoping we might speak privately." Harold gestured toward the kitchen table. "Coffee? That would be— yes, thank you." Caldwell seemed surprised by the civil reception. As Harold poured 2 mugs of coffee from the pot he'd brewed an hour earlier, Caldwell took in the modest kitchen with its worn but spotless countertops and the wall covered with family photographs spanning generations. "I suppose you've come about the Willow Creek auction," Harold said, placing a mug in front of Caldwell and taking the seat across from him. "Yes." Caldwell wrapped his hands around the mug but didn't drink. "The Historical Commission has issued formal notification of the preliminary designation. We've rescheduled the auction for next month with full disclosure of the restrictions." Harold nodded but said nothing, allowing the uncomfortable silence to stretch between them. "Mr. Thompson," Caldwell finally continued, "I owe you an apology for how you were treated at the auction. It was unprofessional and disrespectful." "Is that an apology to me specifically?" Harold asked quietly, "or to any farmer who might have interrupted your auction with inconvenient information?" Caldwell flinched slightly at the directness of the question. "Both, I suppose. The senator's intervention has prompted some reflection. My son tends to have that effect on people," Harold replied, with the hint of a smile, "though I suspect the potential legal consequences might have contributed to your reflective mood as well. The State Real Estate Commission has opened an inquiry into my disclosure practices," Caldwell admitted, staring into his coffee. "Your son's office provided them with documentation of several properties where historical or environmental restrictions weren't properly disclosed." Harold took a slow sip of his coffee, studying the man across from him. In his auction house domain, Caldwell projected confident authority. Here, in a farmer's kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a life spent in connection to the land, he seemed diminished somehow. "You know," Harold said finally, I've lived in Riverdale County my entire life. I've watched it change, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Change itself isn't the enemy. It's how we manage that change that matters. Caldwell looked up, seeming surprised by the philosophical turn. I didn't come to your auction to stop the sale, Harold continued. The Willow family decided to sell, and that's their right. I came because buyers deserve to know what they're purchasing, including its limitations and its treasures. The archaeological site will significantly reduce the development potential, Caldwell observed. The property value will likely decrease by 30% or more. Perhaps in conventional terms, Harold countered. But have you considered there might be buyers who value that history, who might see potential in preserving it while developing the remainder of the property in compatible ways? Caldwell's expression suggested this was an entirely new concept to him. What kind of buyer would pay premium prices for land they can't fully develop? The kind who understands that some values can't be measured purely in dollars, Harold replied. The kind who sees opportunity in working with the land's history rather than erasing it. He rose and retrieved a folder from a nearby desk, setting it before Caldwell. This contains everything I know about the Willow Creek archaeological site, including which areas are most significant and which have less historical importance. It also includes information about similar sites that have been successfully integrated into development projects. Caldwell opened the folder, scanning the meticulously organized materials with surprise. You prepared this for me? I prepared it for whoever might purchase Willow Creek, Harold corrected. Knowledge shouldn't be hoarded, Mr. Caldwell. It should be shared with those who need it to make better decisions. For several minutes, Caldwell reviewed the materials in silence. Harold noticed how the auctioneer's expression gradually shifted from skepticism to thoughtful consideration. This actually changes the story of the property, Caldwell said finally. Instead of positioning the restrictions as limitations, we could market the archaeological site as a unique feature, something that distinguishes this property from every other development opportunity in the region. Now you're thinking like someone who values what makes a place unique, Harold observed, rather than someone trying to make every piece of land interchangeable with every other. Caldwell closed the folder, his brow furrowed in thought. Mr. Thompson, would you consider consulting on the marketing of this property? Your knowledge could help us find the right buyer, one who appreciates both its development potential and its historical significance. The request was so unexpected that Harold nearly laughed. You want the worn-out farmer with nostalgic fantasies to help you sell land. Caldwell had the grace to look embarrassed. Those words were regrettable, and as it turns out, profoundly short-sighted. You understand this land in ways I never considered. Harold studied the auctioneer for a long moment, weighing his sincerity. I'll consider it, Mr. Caldwell, not to help you specifically, but because I care about what happens to Willow Creek. Someone should advocate for the land itself in this transaction. As Caldwell prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Your son. He's built quite a reputation in Washington. People listen when he speaks. James learned early that how you treat people matters more than your title or bank account. Harold replied, he remembers what it means to be from Riverdale County, even when he's walking the halls of the capital. He's fortunate to have had such a teacher, Caldwell said, surprising them both with the sincerity in his voice. After Caldwell's departure, Harold walked out to his small vegetable fields. the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across rows of heirloom tomatoes and peppers. He considered the unexpected turn of events, from being humiliated and ejected from an auction to being asked to consult on the property's sale. The irony wasn't lost on him. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The screen showed his son's name. "The Historical Commission just called," Senator Thompson said after they exchanged greetings. "Caldwell has requested a detailed assessment of the archaeological site to help market the property appropriately. Did something happen I should know about?" Harold smiled. "Let's just say Mr. Caldwell might be developing an appreciation for historical value that goes beyond building age and architectural significance." "That's unexpected," his son replied, the surprise evident in his voice. "Think it's genuine?" "Nah, time will tell," Harold said, looking out across his small farm to the hills beyond, where generations of families, indigenous and settler alike, had tended the land in their own ways. "But sometimes, James, people can surprise you when you give them a chance to reconsider their perspective." The rescheduled auction for Willow Creek Farm took place 6 weeks later on a crisp December morning. The atmosphere in Pinecrest Auction House bore little resemblance to the previous event. Enlarged aerial photographs of the property lined the walls, with the archaeological site clearly marked. Beside each image stood informational displays explaining the historical significance of the indigenous settlement and its place in the region's cultural heritage. Victor Caldwell, still impeccably dressed but somehow less imposing than before, moved through the gathering crowd with Harold Thompson at his side. Together, they answered questions from potential buyers about both the property's development potential and its historical significance. The northern section contains the most extensive archaeological remains, Harold explained to a group of interested investors, indicating areas on a detailed map. "But that doesn't mean it can't be an asset to the right development. Several universities have expressed interest in research partnerships, and similar sites in other states have become significant heritage tourism destinations." Caldwell added, "The preliminary development concepts we've included demonstrate how the archaeological preserve could become the centerpiece of a unique residential community, one that celebrates the land's history rather than erasing it." The attendees at this auction differed noticeably from the previous one. While some corporate representatives had returned, they were joined by conservation investors, heritage tourism developers, and even representatives from several indigenous nations with historical connections to the region. As the auction began, Caldwell took his position at the podium with a different energy than before. His typical aggressive sales approach had been replaced by something more thoughtful. "Welcome to this special auction for the historic Willow Creek Farm," he began. "As you're all aware, this 480-acre property includes a recently discovered archaeological site of significant importance, a discovery that enriches our understanding of this land's long human history." He gestured toward Harold, who sat near the front. "We're fortunate to have Mr. Harold Thompson with us today, whose knowledge of local history and dedication to preservation helped bring this site to proper attention. Before we begin the bidding, Mr. Thompson will provide some context about what makes this property truly exceptional." Harold hadn't expected this public acknowledgement. He rose slowly, making his way to the podium as a respectful hush fell over the room. "Willow Creek has been many things over the centuries," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone deeply connected to the land he described. For over 300 years, it was home to indigenous peoples who built a thriving community along its waters. Later, it became farmland tended by generations of the Willow family, who worked this soil for nearly 2 centuries. He looked out at the diverse group of potential buyers. What happens next is up to whoever purchases this land today. But I hope you'll remember that you're not just buying acreage and buildings. You're becoming part of this land's ongoing story. The decisions you make will write the next chapter in a narrative that began long before any of us were here and will continue long after we're gone. But as Harold returned to his seat, Senator Thompson, who had arrived without fanfare and taken a seat in the back row, caught his father's eye and nodded with unmistakable pride. The bidding proceeded with a different rhythm than the typical Caldwell auction. Rather than rapid-fire increments focused solely on price, Caldwell took time to highlight different aspects of the property as the bidding advanced, emphasizing both development potential and historical significance. When the final gavel fell, Willow Creek Farm had sold for $8 million, significantly less than the $7.4 million bid at the previous auction, but substantially more than many had predicted given the development restrictions. The buyer, a consortium led by a sustainable development firm with experience in heritage properties, immediately announced plans for a mixed-use project that would include an archaeological preserve, educational center, and residential community, designed to complement the land's historical character. As the attendees dispersed, Caldwell approached Harold and the senator, who had joined his father near the displays. "A successful outcome, I think," Caldwell said, extending his hand to Harold. "Thank you for your guidance throughout this process. It's been educational." Harold accepted the handshake. "The land found the right steward. That's what matters." "Mr. Caldwell," Senator Thompson said, "I understand you voluntarily submitted all your upcoming auctions for review by the State Real Estate Commission to ensure proper disclosure of any historical or environmental designations." "Yes, Senator," Caldwell confirmed, straightening his shoulders slightly, "and we're implementing new protocols for all properties going forward. Every auction will include comprehensive information about potential restrictions or special designations, even those still in the application process." "That's commendable," the senator acknowledged. "Preventive compliance is always preferable to regulatory enforcement." "Your father helped me understand something important," Caldwell said, glancing at Harold. "That the highest value of land isn't always measured by its development potential. Sometimes its history and character are what make it truly valuable, if we're willing to see it." As Caldwell moved away to finalize paperwork with the buyers, Senator Thompson turned to his father. "You've made quite an impression on him." Harold smiled slightly. "Sometimes people just need to be reminded of what really matters, even auctioneers who think farmers are living in the past." "Speaking of what matters," the senator said, checking his watch, "we should head out if we're going to make it to Alice's piano recital. Caroline will never forgive us if we're late for her solo." "Wouldn't miss my granddaughter's performance for anything," Harold replied, gathering his notes. "Not even for making history at an auction house." 6 months after the momentous Willow Creek auction, Riverdale County was experiencing what locals had begun calling the preservation renaissance. The auction had sparked conversations about heritage, land use, and community identity that extended far beyond that single property. Though few would have predicted it, Victor Caldwell stood at the center of this transformation. On a warm spring morning, Caldwell's luxury car pulled up to Harold Thompson's modest farmhouse once again. This time he carried a portfolio of documents and moved with the confidence of someone arriving for an established meeting rather than an uncomfortable apology. Harold greeted him from the porch, where he sat sorting seed packets for his summer planting. "Right on time, Victor. Coffee's fresh." The transition to first-name basis had evolved naturally over months of collaboration. What had begun as an uneasy consultation had developed into something neither man could have anticipated, a partnership that was reshaping land transactions throughout the region. In the kitchen, they settled at the table now covered with maps and development proposals. Harold poured coffee into mugs as Caldwell arranged his materials. "The Reynolds Farm auction is scheduled for next month," Caldwell began, opening his portfolio. The historical assessment identified that old grist mill foundation on the creek. Not significant enough for a formal designation, but definitely worth preserving as a historical feature. Harold nodded, examining the survey results. The mill dates back to 1856, one of the first in the county. The foundation is solid stone, could be incorporated into a recreational area or community feature. "Exactly what I was thinking," Caldwell replied, pulling out architectural renderings. "I've had preliminary concepts drawn up showing how the foundation could become the centerpiece of a common area. We'll include these in the marketing materials to attract the right kind of buyer." Harold studied the renderings with approval. "You've come a long way from selling clean properties with no complications," Caldwell smiled ruefully. "I've discovered that what I once saw as complications can actually be selling points to the right buyers. The Johnson property auction last month brought 15% above projected value specifically because of the wetland conservation area we highlighted." This new approach hadn't emerged overnight. After the Willow Creek auction, Caldwell had faced a reckoning that extended beyond that single property. The State Real Estate Commission's investigation into his prior auctions had identified 7 properties where environmental or historical restrictions hadn't been properly disclosed, resulting in significant fines and a 1-month suspension of his auctioneer's license. Rather than retreating or becoming defensive, Caldwell had used that month to reassess his entire business model. He'd approached Harold with a proposition: help him develop a new framework for agricultural auctions that would comprehensively document a property's historical, environmental, and cultural assets alongside its development potential. "I've finalized the format for our new property portfolios," Caldwell said, sliding a bound document across the table. "Environmental assessment, historical significance, water resources, soil quality, and community context, all presented with equal prominence to development potential." Harold flipped through the comprehensive document, noting the careful attention to details that most auctioneers would have considered irrelevant just months earlier. "This is thorough, Victor. Buyers will have a complete picture of what they're bidding on." "That's the goal," Caldwell replied. "No more surprised investors discovering restrictions after purchase. No more lost heritage sites bulldozed because no one knew their significance." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a truck bearing the logo of Willow Creek Heritage Farms, the new development taking shape on the property that had catalyzed their unlikely partnership. The driver, a young woman in her early, 30s, waved to Harold as she pulled up. "That'll be Megan with the seedlings for your demonstration garden," Harold explained, rising from the table. Megan Jenkins, the Sustainability Director for the Willow Creek Development, carried a flat of heirloom vegetable starts as she approached the porch. "Morning, Mr. Thompson. We've got the Cherokee purple tomatoes and Moon and Stars watermelons you requested. The school kids are excited about planting them next week." "Perfect timing," Harold replied. "We were just discussing the educational components for future developments." Megan nodded to Caldwell. "Your auction house has been generating quite a buzz in sustainable development circles, Mr. Caldwell. Your approach to heritage marketing is being discussed as a model in my graduate seminar on conservation development." Caldwell seemed momentarily taken aback by this information. "I wasn't aware our work had attracted academic attention." "Are you kidding?" Megan laughed. "The integration of archaeological preservation with contemporary development at Willow Creek is becoming a case study. Professor Harris mentioned you might be willing to speak to our class sometime." After Megan departed with plans finalized for the school garden project, Caldwell sat quietly, processing this unexpected information. "Something wrong?" Harold asked. 6 months ago, I was known for delivering clean properties to developers who wanted to erase everything that came before," Caldwell replied. "Now I'm being discussed in university classes for preservation-oriented marketing." Harold smiled. "Life takes interesting turns sometimes. Speaking of which, there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you." He retrieved a folder from his desk and placed it before Caldwell. Inside were photographs and documents related to a small farm on the outskirts of town. "The Davis property," Caldwell recognized immediately. "They're planning to auction next year when Mrs. Davis moves to assisted living." "Correct," Harold confirmed, "but there's something about that property you should know. It was part of the Underground Railroad network before the Civil War. The root cellar beneath the summer kitchen has a hidden chamber where escaped slaves were sheltered on their journey north." Caldwell studied the historical documentation with growing interest. "This isn't in any of the county historical records." "Because it was secret by necessity," Harold explained. "The knowledge was passed down through generations of the Davis family. Mrs. Davis showed me the chamber 20 years ago, but swore me to secrecy until she was ready to sell. She's given permission now to document this history before the property changes hands." Caldwell immediately grasped the significance. "This changes everything about how we'd position that property. Instead of marketing it as a simple farmstead with development potential, we'd be offering a piece of profound historical significance." "Exactly," Harold agreed. "But it needs proper documentation and preservation planning before auction. The wrong buyer could destroy this piece of history without ever knowing it existed." Caldwell was already thinking ahead. "We should bring in historical architects to document the chamber, maybe apply for historical designation to protect it specifically without restricting the entire property." "My thoughts exactly," Harold said, "and Mrs. Davis would rest easier, knowing this part of her family's legacy will be preserved." "You know," Caldwell said thoughtfully, 6 months ago, I would have seen this as a complication to be minimized or hidden. Now I see it as the property's most valuable feature, something that makes it unique and irreplaceable." Harold nodded. "That's the most important shift in your thinking, Victor. Land isn't just square footage and zoning potential. It carries stories, some buried in the soil and some passed down through generations. Those stories have value too, not just cultural or historical value, but increasingly market value as well." Later that afternoon, Caldwell found himself in an unexpected location, the grand opening of the Willow Creek Archaeological Center. The state-of-the-art facility, situated at the edge of the preserved indigenous settlement site, represented the developer's commitment to honoring the land's history while creating a contemporary community around it. The center's modern architecture intentionally echoed elements discovered in the ancient settlement, a subtle bridging of past and present that created a unique sense of place. Inside, interactive displays told the story of the indigenous people, who had lived there for centuries, their agricultural practices, social structures, and relationship with the land. Senator Thompson was scheduled to speak at the dedication ceremony, and Harold had insisted Caldwell attend. "You helped make this possible," Harold had told him. "You should see what your change of approach accomplished." Now, as Caldwell moved through the crowd of local residents, academics, indigenous representatives, and new homeowners from the development, he felt strangely out of place, yet somehow involved in a way he'd never experienced in his career. People who recognized him often stopped to shake his hand, thanking him for his role in preserving the site rather than allowing it to be destroyed for conventional development. "Mr. Caldwell," called a voice, and he turned to find himself face to face with Senator Thompson. "Senator," he acknowledged with a nod, still somewhat uncomfortable in the politician's presence, given their first contentious meeting. "I'm glad you could join us today," the senator said, surprising Caldwell with his warmth. "My father speaks highly of the work you've been doing these past months." Caldwell glanced across the room where Harold was engaged in animated conversation with several indigenous elders discussing traditional agricultural practices that had once been employed on this very land. "Your father has been instrumental in my education," Caldwell replied carefully. "He's helped me see value where I previously saw only obstacles." "That's one of his gifts," the senator agreed, "helping people recognize the worth of things they've overlooked. I'd like to discuss something with you if you have a moment." He led Caldwell to a quieter corner of the exhibit hall. "I'm working on legislation to create incentives for heritage-sensitive development, tax benefits, expedited permitting, and grant opportunities for projects that incorporate historical and cultural preservation in meaningful ways." Caldwell listened with growing interest as the senator outlined a vision for development that honored a community's past while creating its future. "The auction materials you've developed with my father for marketing heritage properties could serve as a model for the documentation standards in this legislation," the senator continued. "Would you be willing to consult with my staff on practical implementation from an industry perspective?" 6 months earlier, Caldwell would have viewed government involvement in his business practices as unwelcome interference. Now, he recognized an opportunity to help shape standards that aligned with his evolving approach. "I'd be honored, Senator," he replied. "What we're learning through trial and error could help create a framework that benefits communities, developers, and property values simultaneously." The formal dedication ceremony began with a blessing from indigenous representatives, acknowledging the ancestors who had lived on this land. The developer spoke about the journey from initial concept to the integrated community now taking shape, homes and businesses designed to complement the landscape rather than dominate it, with the archaeological site serving as its cultural and educational heart. When Senator Thompson took the podium, he spoke about the deeper meaning of preservation, "What we protect tells future generations what we value," he said, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. "By preserving this site, we declare that the story of this land didn't begin with European settlement, that we value the knowledge, culture and history of all who have called this place home." He acknowledged the developer's vision, the indigenous community's guidance, and the local historical commission's persistence. Then, to Caldwell's surprise, the senator continued, "I also want to recognize the evolution in our approach to land transactions that made this possible. Victor Caldwell's auction house has pioneered a new model for agricultural land sales, one that treats historical and cultural features as assets rather than liabilities." Caldwell felt countless eyes turn toward him as the senator added, "His willingness to transform his business practices demonstrates that economic prosperity and cultural preservation aren't opposing forces. They're complementary values that strengthen each other when properly aligned." The acknowledgement from a man who had once confronted him in front of clients left Caldwell momentarily speechless. As applause rippled through the crowd, he caught Harold's eye across the room. The old farmer gave him a slight nod that somehow conveyed both approval and the understanding that this transformation remained a work in progress. After the ceremony, attendees toured the archaeological site, where carefully designed pathways allowed visitors to view the excavated portions of the ancient settlement without disturbing sensitive areas. Professional archaeologists explained their ongoing work, pointing out features that revealed how the indigenous community had lived in harmony with the seasonal patterns of the land. Caldwell found himself walking alongside Harold, both men silent as they absorbed the significance of what had been preserved. "You know," Caldwell finally said, "when I was having you escorted out of my auction house, I never imagined I'd be standing here 6 months later, being acknowledged by a United States Senator for preservation work." Harold chuckled. "Life rarely follows the path we expect. Sometimes it takes an unexpected detour to show us where we should have been heading all along." They paused at an overlook that provided a sweeping view of both the archaeological site and the new development taking shape around it. The architectural harmony between them was striking. Modern homes designed with subtle references to the indigenous structures, oriented to the same seasonal patterns, respecting the natural contours of the land. "I was wrong, you know," Caldwell admitted quietly, "when I said that land belongs to those who can afford it. The truth is more complicated than that." "How do you see it now?" Harold asked. Caldwell considered the question carefully. "Land has memory longer than any deed or title. We might hold legal ownership for a time, but we're still answerable to something deeper, the patterns and principles embedded in the land itself. Ignoring those patterns eventually creates problems no legal document can resolve." Harold nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Not bad for an auctioneer who once specialized in clean properties with no complications. The following month brought the first test of their new approach with a high-profile auction of the Miller Farm, a 350-acre property with both agricultural value and development potential. Unlike previous auctions, Caldwell had marketed this one specifically to conservation-minded investors, highlighting not just its development capacity, but its historical features, wildlife habitat, and potential for sustainable agriculture. The auction catalogue, developed with Harold's guidance, contained comprehensive documentation of the property's natural and cultural resources, alongside traditional information about zoning and infrastructure. Each potential restriction was presented, not as a limitation, but as an opportunity for distinctive, place-appropriate development. The morning of the auction, Caldwell found himself unusually nervous as he prepared the auction house for the event. The traditional rows of seating had been rearranged to accommodate display stations around the perimeter of the room, each highlighting different aspects of the property, from soil quality maps to historical documentation of the 19th century. "Homestead? Having second thoughts?" Harold asked, arriving early to help with final preparations. "Not about the approach," Caldwell replied, adjusting displays. "But this is the first major auction since we implemented the new format. What if buyers aren't interested in this level of detail? What if they just want maximum development potential with minimum restrictions? Then they're not the right buyers for this property," Harold said simply. "Better to attract fewer bidders who understand the land's true value than a room full of people who'll destroy what makes it special." As the auction time approached, Caldwell watched with growing relief as the room filled with a diverse group of potential buyers. Traditional developers were present, but so were conservation investors, sustainable agriculture representatives, and even a community land trust looking to preserve working farmland. When Caldwell took the podium, he surveyed the assembled bidders with a sense of purpose that felt different from his previous focus on driving up prices at any cost. "Welcome to what I believe is a new chapter in agricultural land auctions," he began. "Today's property offers not just acreage and development potential, but a unique combination of historical features, natural resources, and agricultural heritage. Our goal is to find the right steward for this land, someone who values all these dimensions and will build upon them rather than erasing them." The auction proceeded with a different rhythm than his previous sales. Instead of rapid-fire bidding focused solely on price, Caldwell took time between bids to highlight different aspects of the property, from its water resources to the historical significance of its original homestead. When the final bid was accepted, the property sold for 8% above its pre-auction valuation. Not the dramatic markup Caldwell had sometimes achieved in the past by downplaying restrictions, but a fair price that reflected the property's true character and potential. The buyer, a sustainable development firm specializing in agricultural communities, approached Caldwell and Harold after the auction concluded. "Your property portfolio made all the difference," the developer said, shaking both their hands. "The comprehensive documentation helped us envision a project that works with the land's character rather than imposing our standard model. We actually value the historical elements you highlighted. They'll give our development a sense of place that can't be manufactured." As the auction house emptied, Caldwell found himself standing with Harold amid the displays they had created. Together, the physical embodiment of their new approach to land transactions. "A success, I'd say," Harold observed. "Yes," Caldwell agreed, "though not in the way I would have defined success a year ago. We didn't achieve the highest possible price, regardless of consequences. We found the right buyer at a fair price that reflects the land's true value." "And that's the difference," Harold said. "You're no longer just selling land. You're matching properties with people who will be good stewards of them." Caldwell considered this characterization. "I'm still an auctioneer, Harold. I still work for the sellers and aim to get them fair market value. But I've realized that fair market value includes recognizing what makes each property unique and finding buyers who value those qualities." Harold smiled. That's all I ever hoped you'd understand. Land isn't just a commodity. It's a relationship between people and place, past and future, natural systems and human needs. When we honor that relationship in our transactions, everyone benefits, buyers, sellers, and the community that will live with the results long after the sale is forgotten. As they gathered their materials, Caldwell paused. You know, when your son arrived with his convoy and shut down my auction, I thought my business was ruined. Instead, it was transformed into something more meaningful than I could have imagined. Sometimes, Harold replied, glancing at a photograph of the indigenous archaeological site now protected at Willow Creek, the things we initially see as obstacles become the foundation for something better than we had planned. The land teaches that lesson to anyone willing to listen. 5 years later, the National Rural Heritage Conference in Washington, D.C. buzzed with energy as delegates from agricultural communities across the country gathered to exchange ideas about land stewardship, historical preservation, and sustainable development. The grand ballroom of the conference center was filled to capacity for the keynote address, redefining value, the transformation of rural land markets. At the podium stood Victor Caldwell, his appearance subtly changed from the aggressive auctioneer of years past. His suit was still impeccably tailored, but his demeanor carried a thoughtful gravitas that came from years of reimagining his life's work. Behind him, a large screen displayed the now iconic image of the Willow Creek Heritage Center, a modern building seamlessly integrated with an ancient indigenous settlement surrounded by homes and farms designed to honor the land's natural contours. 5 years ago, Caldwell began, his voice carrying clearly through the attentive crowd, I stood in my auction house preparing to sell a historic farm to the highest bidder with no regard for its cultural significance or ecological value. My business model was simple: minimize complications, maximize development potential, and drive up the price. He paused, his gaze moving across the diverse audience of farmers, developers, preservationists, and policymakers. That day, an elderly farmer named Harold Thompson tried to inform potential buyers about an archaeological site on the property, evidence of an indigenous settlement that had thrived there for centuries before European arrival. I had him escorted from the building. Murmurs rippled through the audience as Caldwell continued. 20 minutes later, a United States senator arrived to halt the auction. That senator happened to be Harold Thompson's son, and he came armed with documentation of a pending historical designation that I had failed to disclose to buyers. Caldwell's voice softened slightly. What could have ended my career instead began its transformation. Over the past 5 years, what started as a humbling lesson in legal compliance has evolved into something I never could have imagined, a completely new approach to valuing and transferring rural land. In the front row, Harold Thompson sat beside his son, now in his second term in the Senate and recently appointed chair of the Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. At 77, Harold's face showed more lines. His hair had whitened completely, but his eyes remained sharp and engaged as he listened to the man who had once dismissed him as irrelevant. Throughout the day, conference attendees had toured displays showcasing the Thompson-Caldwell method of comprehensive land assessment, now implemented in rural communities across 17 states. What had begun as a reluctant partnership between an elderly farmer and a chastened auctioneer had evolved into a framework that was transforming how agricultural land was valued and transferred. The fundamental insight that changed everything, Caldwell continued, advancing to a slide showing a comprehensive property portfolio, was recognizing that land carries multiple forms of value: agricultural, ecological, historical, and cultural. When we document and market these values rather than treating them as obstacles to development, we attract buyers who will be better stewards of the land. He clicked to the next slide, showing before and after images of several properties sold. Through his auction house, each after image showed development that preserved historical features, protected ecological assets, and maintained agricultural productivity while still creating economic value. The results have exceeded our most optimistic projections, Caldwell explained. Properties marketed with comprehensive historical and ecological assessments have sold for an average of 12% more than comparable properties marketed traditionally. More importantly, these sales have resulted in developments that enhance rather than diminish community character and environmental health. As Caldwell's presentation continued, he highlighted case studies from across the country where the approach pioneered in Riverdale County had been adapted to local conditions. A California vineyard where indigenous agricultural methods had been incorporated into modern wine production. A New England dairy farm where Revolutionary-era structures had become the centerpiece of an agricultural education center. A Texas ranch where wildlife corridors had been preserved alongside cattle operations. What began as a confrontation in an auction house has evolved into a collaborative model that bridges traditional divides between development and preservation, between profit and stewardship, between economic and cultural values, Caldwell concluded. And none of it would have happened without the wisdom and persistence of a farmer who refused to remain silent when he saw heritage at risk of being erased. The applause that followed reflected not just appreciation for the presentation, but recognition of a fundamental shift in thinking about land value. A shift that was gaining momentum in rural communities across the nation. After the keynote, the conference broke into specialized sessions, with Victor Caldwell leading a workshop on implementing comprehensive assessment protocols for land transactions. The room was packed with auctioneers, real estate professionals, and rural development officials eager to learn how to apply the approach in their own communities. The key insight, Caldwell explained to the attentive group, is that restrictions we once viewed as liabilities can actually become assets when properly documented and marketed to appropriate buyers. A wetland that prevents conventional development might be perfect for a conservation-minded buyer who values wildlife habitat. An archaeological site that requires preservation can become the distinctive feature that makes a development unique in the marketplace. As the workshop progressed, participants shared their own experiences and challenges in rural land transactions. A real estate agent from Montana described the tension between out-of-state buyers seeking pristine views and local ranchers needing to maintain working landscapes. A county planner from Georgia discussed the pressure to convert agricultural land to suburban development despite community wishes to preserve farming heritage. These tensions aren't new, Caldwell acknowledged. What's new is our approach to resolving them. Instead of positioning development and preservation as opposing forces, we're finding ways they can complement each other. He displayed a sample property portfolio showing how a farm in Riverdale County had been marketed not just for its development potential, but for its historical features, soil quality, water resources, and cultural significance. By documenting these aspects comprehensively, we attracted buyers who valued the property's unique character rather than seeing it as a blank slate for generic development. The result was a higher sale price for the seller and a better outcome for the community. In another conference room, Senator Thompson led a panel on policy innovations supporting rural heritage preservation. Harold sat in the audience, observing with quiet pride as his son outlined legislation inspired by their experiences in Riverdale County. The Rural Heritage Investment Act creates financial incentives for development that preserves agricultural, land and cultural resources, the senator explained. Tax credits, expedited permitting, and grant opportunities for projects that integrate preservation with economic development. He acknowledged the challenges of implementation. This isn't about stopping development or keeping rural communities frozen in time. It's about ensuring that change happens in ways that honor what makes each place unique and valuable. The senator's gaze found his father in the audience. My perspective on these issues was shaped by growing up with a father who taught me that land isn't just a commodity to be bought and sold for maximum profit. It's a trust we hold temporarily, with obligations to both past and future generations. As the day's sessions concluded, attendees gathered for an evening reception in the conference center's atrium, where displays showcased successful heritage-conscious developments from across the country. Among them stood a detailed model of the Willow Creek community, the development that had grown from the contentious auction 5 years earlier. Harold Thompson found himself standing beside Victor Caldwell as they observed a group of young farmers and developers engaged in animated conversation about adaptive reuse of historic agricultural structures. "Look at them," Harold said quietly. 5 years ago, those two groups would have been in opposing camps. Now they're collaborating. Caldwell nodded. That's perhaps the most significant change, breaking down the artificial divisions between preservation and progress, between honoring heritage and creating prosperity. Not an easy lesson for some to learn, Harold observed with a slight smile. Certainly wasn't for me, Caldwell acknowledged. I still remember the shock of seeing Senator Thompson's convoy pull into my auction house parking lot. In that moment, I was certain my business was finished. And now you're keynoting national conferences on the approach that emerged from that confrontation, Harold replied. Life takes unexpected turns. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young woman in her early 30s, Dr. Megan Jenkins, now director of the Willow Creek Archaeological Center and an emerging voice in heritage conservation. Mr. Thompson, Mr. Caldwell, she greeted them warmly. The University of Virginia team just finished their 3rd season of excavation at Willow Creek. We've discovered evidence of agricultural practices that could have significant applications for sustainable farming today. She explained how the indigenous farmers who had lived at Willow Creek centuries ago had developed sophisticated techniques for soil conservation and water management, methods that modern farmers were now beginning to implement on adjacent lands. The knowledge was there all along, Megan concluded, buried in the soil, waiting to be rediscovered. If the site had been bulldozed for conventional development, these insights would have been lost forever. After she departed, Caldwell turned to Harold with a thoughtful expression. She reminds me of something I've been meaning to ask you. When you stood up in my auction that day, did you have any idea what it would lead to? Did you envision all of this? Harold chuckled softly. Not in the slightest. I just knew that archaeological site shouldn't be destroyed without buyers at least knowing it existed. I was thinking about one piece of land, not a national movement. And yet here we are. Caldwell gestured to the diverse gathering of rural advocates who had assembled to learn from their experience. The following morning, the conference featured a special ceremony recognizing pioneers in rural heritage preservation. Senator Thompson took the podium to present the inaugural Rural Heritage Stewardship Award. This award recognizes individuals who have made extraordinary contributions to preserving the character and cultural resources of rural America while creating paths for sustainable economic development, he explained. I can think of no more deserving recipient than someone who has transformed how we think about the value of rural land. The senator smiled. Though I admit I'm hardly an impartial judge, given that the recipient is my father, Harold Thompson. Applause filled the room as Harold made his way to the podium, his gait slower than 5 years ago, but his presence still commanding respect. The award, a bronze sculpture depicting hands cradling soil from which a seedling emerged, represented the philosophy he had lived by throughout his life. I'm honored by this recognition, Harold began, though I must say it feels somewhat undeserved. I didn't set out to create a movement or change national policy. I simply stood up for something I believed in, that the history embedded in our land deserves respect, and that those who purchase property should know what they're buying, both its possibilities and its responsibilities. He glanced toward Victor Caldwell in the front row. What's remarkable isn't that I spoke up that day in the auction house. What's remarkable is that someone who initially dismissed those concerns was willing to reconsider his perspective and ultimately become the most effective advocate for a new approach to land valuation. Harold held up the award. This recognition belongs not just to me, but to everyone who has worked to bridge the false divide between preservation and development, between honoring the past and creating the future. Particularly to Victor Caldwell, whose transformation from adversary to ally demonstrates that change is always possible when we're willing to see value in what we once dismissed. The afternoon of the conference's final day featured a special tour of the National Agricultural Heritage Center, where a new exhibit documented the evolution of the Thompson-Caldwell method and its impact on rural communities nationwide. The exhibit included interactive displays showing before and after results in communities that had adopted the comprehensive assessment approach. As conference attendees explored the exhibit, Harold found himself approached by a group of young farmers from diverse backgrounds, participants in an agricultural leadership program sponsored by Senator Thompson's office. "Mr. Thompson," one young woman said, "your son mentioned you might be willing to share some thoughts about balancing tradition and innovation in farming communities. We're all facing pressure to either abandon traditional practices entirely or reject new approaches that might be beneficial." Harold considered the question thoughtfully. "The wisdom I've gained over my lifetime isn't about choosing between tradition and innovation. It's about understanding that the best innovations often emerge from deep knowledge of tradition." He led them to a display showing the indigenous agricultural techniques discovered at the Willow Creek archaeological site. These farming methods, developed over centuries of careful observation and adaptation to local conditions. Modern farmers are now finding that incorporating these ancient practices improves soil health while reducing the need for chemical inputs. The young farmers listened intently as Harold continued. The key is approaching both tradition and innovation with genuine curiosity rather than rigid ideology. Ask what purpose a traditional practice served and whether that purpose still matters. Today, ask what problem a new technology solves and whether that problem exists in your specific context. One young man raised his hand. But how do we preserve agricultural heritage when economic pressures push toward consolidation and development? That's where our work in reforming land transactions becomes essential, Harold replied. By documenting and valuing the multiple dimensions of agricultural land, not just its development potential, we create markets that reward good stewardship. The Willow Creek model demonstrates that development and preservation can coexist when we're thoughtful about design and placement. As the young farmers continued their questions, Victor Caldwell observed from a distance, struck by the natural authority Harold projected despite his advanced age and modest demeanor. The worn-out farmer with nostalgic fantasies he had dismissed years ago was now a respected elder whose wisdom was sought by a new generation of agricultural leaders. Later that evening, at a small dinner gathering of conference organizers and speakers, Senator Thompson raised his glass in a toast. "To unexpected partnerships," he said, nodding toward his father and Caldwell, "and to the recognition that our most contentious disagreements sometimes contain the seeds of our most important innovations." As conversations flowed around the table, Harold and Victor found themselves momentarily apart from the others. "Your son's legislation is gaining impressive bipartisan support," Caldwell noted. "The Rural Heritage Investment Act might actually pass in this session." Harold nodded. "James has always understood that preserving agricultural heritage isn't a partisan issue. It's about maintaining the character and health of rural communities, regardless of political affiliation." "Something I've come to appreciate as well," Caldwell replied, "though it took a rather dramatic intervention to open my eyes." Harold smiled slightly. "Sometimes we need a jolt to see beyond our established patterns. I'm just grateful you were willing to reconsider your approach, rather than simply moving to another county where you weren't known." "I considered it," Caldwell admitted. "For about a week after the auction, I seriously thought about relocating my business. But something you said that day kept coming back to me." "What was that?" "You said the land carries history and responsibility. At the time, I dismissed it as sentimentality, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The more properties I researched, the more I realized how much history was being erased in the transactions I facilitated, not just archaeological sites, but farming practices, water knowledge, community connections." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I've built my career on the transfer of land, Harold, but you helped me understand that what's really being transferred isn't just legal ownership. It's a relationship with something that existed long before us and will continue long after we're gone." The following day, as the conference concluded and attendees prepared to return to their communities across the country, Harold and Victor stood in the lobby of the conference center, watching the diverse groups of participants engaging in final conversations. "So what comes next?" Harold asked. "We've helped change how rural land is valued and transferred in 17 states. Where do we go from here? Caldwell smiled at the question. At 59, he was at the height of his professional influence, his auction house having become the national leader in heritage-conscious land transactions. Yet he knew that the work they had begun was far from complete. "International interest is growing," he replied. "I've been invited to present our methodology at conferences in Europe and Australia. The challenges of balancing agricultural heritage with development pressures exist worldwide." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "The principles translate even if the specifics vary by region. Every place has its own history embedded in the landscape, its own knowledge developed over generations. And every place faces the challenge of honoring that heritage while creating viable futures," Caldwell added. "That's the universal tension we're helping to resolve." As they prepared to part ways, Harold returning to Riverdale County, Caldwell continuing to a speaking engagement in Chicago, they paused for a moment of reflection. "5 years ago in that auction house," Caldwell said, "if someone had told me we'd be standing here today as partners recognized for transforming rural land transactions, I would have thought they were delusional." "Life seldom follows the path we expect," Harold replied. "The question is whether we're willing to adjust our course when new insights emerge." He extended his hand, which Caldwell shook with genuine respect. "Safe travels, Victor. I'll see you next month for the Davis Farm assessment." As Harold walked toward the exit where his son waited to drive him to the airport, he passed a display featuring photographs of rural landscapes preserved through the approach he and Caldwell had pioneered. Among them was an aerial view of Willow Creek, showing how the archaeological site had become the heart of a community that balanced preservation with thoughtful development. The land that had been at the center of their confrontation 5 years earlier now stood as living proof that progress didn't require erasing the past, that the most sustainable path forward often involved honoring the wisdom embedded in the landscape itself. Outside the conference center, the spring sun illuminated the national monuments of Washington, D.C., structures designed to preserve the memory of people and principles deemed worthy of remembrance. Harold thought about the less visible monuments they had helped preserve across rural America, the archaeological sites, historic structures, and agricultural landscapes that told equally important stories about the nation's heritage. As he joined his son for the journey home, Harold reflected on the unexpected turns his life had taken since that confrontation in the auction house. The elderly farmer, dismissed as irrelevant, had helped spark a movement that was transforming how rural America valued its land and heritage. The auctioneer who had once had him escorted from the building had become his partner and friend. Most significantly, the principles Harold had defended throughout his life, that land carried both history and responsibility, that its value couldn't be measured solely in dollars, were now being embedded in policies, practices, and educational programs that would continue long after he was gone. The lesson wasn't that one person alone could change entrenched systems. Rather, it was that when people stand up for what matters, even in seemingly small ways, they create possibilities for transformation that extend far beyond their original intentions. What had begun as a simple attempt to protect one archaeological site had evolved into a framework that was helping communities across the nation balance preservation with progress, heritage with innovation, economic value with cultural significance. And it had all started because an elderly farmer refused to remain silent when he saw history about to be erased, and because an auctioneer despite initial resistance, had the wisdom to reconsider his perspective when confronted with a different way of seeing the land that had surrounded him all his life. As the car pulled away from the conference center, Harold caught a final glimpse of the banner hanging above its entrance. Honoring our heritage, creating our future. In those simple words lay the essence of what he and Caldwell had been working toward, not preservation for its own sake, but preservation as the foundation for more meaningful and sustainable development. The confrontation that had begun with humiliation in an auction house had ultimately yielded not to bitterness, but to collaboration, not to division, but to integration of values that once seemed irreconcilable. In that transformation lay, perhaps, the most important lesson of all, that our most profound disagreements sometimes contain the seeds of our most valuable innovations, if only we have the courage and wisdom to nurture them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.